I've spent this past week in Iceland, and I'm just gonna say it, this is the best place on planet Earth to shoot 360 or photography of any kind for that matter. This place is stunning with non-stop landscapes and sunsets that last for 4 hours. When you go into the heart of the country, you think you're dreaming or on another planet. It's just so different to what we're used to in big cities. I shot some of my best 360 content ever here, and I thought it'd be fun to go behind the scenes and take a look at how I got each shot along my journey. Because finding an amazing place to shoot is one thing, but knowing how to shoot it is just as important, if not more so. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through all the best shots I got and how I got them. On day one, I got in pretty late, so by the time I got to the hotel, it was about 10 o'clock, so I shot the previous video on my channel, why I don't post 360 videos, and went to bed. So day two was when the epic 360 adventure began. So I'm very fortunate to have an Icelandic friend. He's a local, and he happens to be the #1 360 photographer in the world. Well, I don't know if there's official rankings, but let me just put it this way. Whenever there's a 360 photo competition, his photos normally come in first, second, or third. And when you live in a place like Iceland, yeah, you can see why. So he picked me up, there we are in the car, and the adventure began. The aim was to go where the tourists don't go, and fortunately for me, he knew Iceland like the back of his hand. After an hour or so of driving, I was already setting up for my first shot. We didn't even need to stop. I put my Insta360 Evo on a selfie stick, put it out the sunroof, and recorded 5 minutes of video. I then reframed it in the app in about 2 minutes into this hyperlapse here. However, now is when the not so fun bit happened. It started raining. And raining, and raining some more. So after another hour or two of driving, we stopped at our first location, and finally the rain had stopped enough for us to get out of the car and start shooting. We were near the edge of a cliff overlooking a river, at the end of which was this amazing gushing waterfall. And not just one, but there were hundreds of smaller waterfalls all around. So I did the obvious, I got my Theta Z1 out and took my very first 360 photo of the day. It did take a few attempts because I kept getting water droplets on the lens, but I actually ended up with an okay tiny planet. And then I heard a buzzing. I turned around, and there was my friend Oliver flying his Mavic Pro 2, who had already taken at least 3 amazing panorama photos. For those that don't know, you can shoot 360 photos directly from DJI drones. There's a mode called Sphere Mode in the panorama settings that essentially takes 21 or so photos, where the camera goes like this, then it turns, goes like this, and it takes really high resolution photos all the way around and stitches them together. So he showed me what he'd done, and I was like, and here's why. Just when I was feeling good about taking a pretty good 360 photo, he had to steal my thunder and take this amazing 360 photo from the sky. At this point, I realized I really am an amateur at 360. I mean, yeah, I've got lots of experience, but my photos aren't on that level. How was I to compete with this? I guess I'll just figure it out later. An hour later, our next stop was at one of the most beautiful sights I'd ever seen. Hours from the closest town at the top of a mountain, we came across a massive blue lake with potentially the bluest water I'd ever seen. You wouldn't have seen this thing unless you made it to the top, but when we did, oh my god, this was really something out of a postcard. The rain was still lightly drizzling, but I didn't care. I had to get a shot at this location. So I set up my monopod and got a few 360s from the edge of the crater. They turned out pretty good, but I feel like the water was still a little bit too far away. Without hesitation, Oliver got out his drone and was already hundreds of meters in the air by the time I got back just minutes later. It was raining, I thought. You can't fly in the rain. Well, yeah, apparently you can. Looking at his screen, I was like, okay, it's time to get my drone out. Even though I hadn't flown in like a year, this was too good of an opportunity to miss, so I got out my Mavic Air, warmed it up, and sent it into the sky. I pretty much remembered how to fly it. How do I rate my drone skills? Yeah, not great. But it was good practice, right? It was windy, it was rainy, they could have turned out better, but I actually rate these shots pretty decently. So there was Mr. Ben, after not flying for a year, producing this amazing aerial masterpiece. And then it happened again. I looked at his screen. How? Why doesn't mine look like that? Then it rained some more, and we shot some more, naturally. And slowly, I got used to shooting with drones in 360 mode. It's really not that hard. All you gotta do is get it up there, try and find the middle of your landscape. The drone always looks further away than it really is, so it does take a while to get used to that, but once you do, all you need to do is put it into panorama mode, then sphere mode, and press the button. Then the drone does everything for you. These images were shot in RAW and stitched in PT GUI, then color corrected in Photoshop. Oliver has a way more advanced workflow where he shoots in bracketing, he patches in the sky, he pays so much attention to every detail, but I'm all about a shorter post-production workflow, so I only did the bare minimum. I just shoot so much content, I don't have time, unfortunately, to work for so long on one individual photo. But from this location, yeah, I'm happy. At that point, I accepted that my drone shots would never be as good as Oliver's because he does this all the time. He's taken so many 360 panoramas from his drone, and it's so funny when you watch him doing it. He's like a little kid playing a game. He can talk to you, look away, and his thumbs just move automatically, and you see what he's doing, and it's like a masterpiece. Like, how did you do that? Like, you didn't even look at the screen. And look, that's how I am with 360 cameras. Eventually, it just comes naturally. So yeah, it was kind of cool to see this guy at work. I'd seen his 360s on Facebook many times before and was blown away. He has a reputation as one of the top guys out there, and then and there I saw why. Just after midnight, the sun began to set, and before we started our 2-hour journey back to Reykjavik, as the tourist, yeah, I had to capture the midnight sunset. So I got out my Z1, put it on my monopod, and shot 2 photos, one in HDR rendering and one in RAW. And this was at a very average location for Iceland standards, but the final result is actually incredible. The car looks so dramatic, the billboards look epic, and the sunset, well, that needs no explaining, that looks incredible. Look at those colors on the skyline. This shot that I put very little effort into ended up being my best 360 camera shot of the day. I got one more quick shot on my Mavic Air, then we headed back to the city. On the third day, I was pretty exhausted from the previous 14-hour day of shooting, so I gave myself permission to just be a tourist and go out and do some shopping. I bought myself a cool new jacket, which was the price of a small car, but I knew I'd need it next time we went out shooting in the Highlands. That place got damn cold at night, so yeah, here it is. This jacket could withstand basically any kind of weather. If a volcano erupted, I'd be good. But also, I'm not really a fan of shopping all day or doing nothing and not being productive, so of course I had to do some kind of shooting. So I paid a visit to Iceland's iconic cathedral in the middle of the city, and this building is absolutely incredible, both inside and out. I started with some shots of the exterior and they ended up pretty good. I put my camera on the ground, and here I lay really close to the camera, and that turned out pretty good. But where this location was much better was on the inside. The architecture was truly incredible. There was just so much symmetry. No matter where you took a photo, you would get an awesome shot. The issue though, there were lots of people there in my shot. So after a few photobombers had passed, I put my camera on the ground and took this inverted planet. Next, I wanted to challenge myself to get a really good interior towards the back of the church. The windows here were really interesting because they were tall and skinny, and they just added to that minimalist look of this church. The sun was blazing in from one side, and I knew inbuilt HDR wouldn't do the job here. So I shot this shot in RAW mode and color corrected in Adobe Camera Raw. While I didn't recover every last highlight, overall I'm really happy with this. This interior looks great. It's always a fun challenge exposing the interior of a church correctly because the windows are always so big and the light is so intense, yet it's so beautiful inside. You will never ever get it right on the first attempt, so prepare for lots of trying and failing. I got the best result here by deliberately underexposing the scene, then bringing up the shadows later because I knew I could recover them, but it's actually much harder to recover highlights, so that was my strategy. If I could have my time again, yeah, I would have tried to get it better, but unfortunately it's too late, and yeah, it was good enough for a simple social media post. The next day, I did the tourist thing. I took a bus trip around the highlights of Iceland with like 60 other people. Our first stop was at this massive crater. I think it was called the Kerrid crater. And this thing was a massive hole in the ground with a little pond at the bottom. It was quite a sight to behold. It was full of tourists, yes, and I was one of them. But the unfortunate thing was we didn't have much time here, so I snapped off a bunch of HDR shots with my Z1, but if I'm gonna be honest, I'm not really happy with them, so I haven't posted any. They just ended up too flat, and I really struggled to capture the vastness of this place in a 360 photo. I don't know, maybe I didn't choose the right location or it was something else, but these photos were nothing to write home about. You can't always take good ones. The vast majority of 360 photos I take are terrible, I can admit that. Next up was at this giant waterfall, and it was extremely beautiful, but extremely crowded with tourists. It wasn't just my bus, but I swear there was like 20 tourist buses filled with 60 people each, all crowding around this massive waterfall enclosure, which meant no matter where you went, you got at least 20 people in your shot. But nevertheless, I carried on, I got a bunch of photos. I took too many HDR shots, that's another mistake I made. HDR is great in so many situations, but I definitely learned at this point that it's not so great in pure sunlight. And luckily I realized this while I was shooting and switched into RAW mode and exposed my shots manually. There was definitely at least one keeper in there, and on my way back to the bus, I chose to shoot this hyperlapse on my 1X. The selfie stick was fully extended above my head, and I recorded 360 video at 5.7K for around 5 minutes. Reframed in the app, and bada bing, bada boom, there you have it. Our next stop was at the Great Geysers of Iceland. Yeah, you know those big water spout things that come from the ground? There was a whole bunch of them around this area, and the biggest one only blew every 9 minutes. I then spent the next hour waiting patiently with my Theta Z1, and I had to make sure the shutter speed was really fast so I could capture that movement of the water in midair. And I got it. And I got it again, and again, and again. Each time I changed something small, whether it was the exposure or the composition. The lighting didn't always work. Capturing water against sky is actually a really tricky thing to do, because especially when it's cloudy, the water blends into the clouds, so it doesn't really have the same epic effect that you might think. So while I did get a bunch of quite good 360s with the geyser, I just know it would have been better with clear blue skies. Turns out you can't control the weather. Just when you need it to be one way, it's like, haha, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna do the opposite. Damn you, weather! Anyway, on the way back to the bus, I got this shot of me stopping to smell the flowers, and then I got there 20 minutes late. Oops. I'd say my day on the tour bus was good, but there were just too many tourists. They were always in my shots somewhere. And when you come to a place to shoot landscapes, you kind of don't want people taking selfies in front of the landscapes. Even though I'm guilty as charged, I can admit it, I'm here to take selfies. But sometimes you just want to go like this. It's actually quite funny looking back at my photos and seeing the reactions of some of the tourists to me shooting with a 360 camera. After the tour ended, I decided to come back to the church and get one last shot. This time I put my camera on a monopod at eye level, and the aim was to capture more of the interesting brick patterns, because even with as little elevation as 5 feet, it's enough to reveal an entirely new area of the scene. I think that one probably ended up being my favorite exterior of this church. There was another landmark within Reykjavik city called the Sun Voyager, and I knew there was some kind of epic 360 shot waiting for me. And it's funny because when I got there, I just intuitively knew what to do. I got my camera out, put it on a small tripod on the ground, adjusted my aperture and shutter speed so the scene became really dark, and created a deliberate silhouette effect. Because remember, the sun doesn't go down in Iceland at this time of year, so you have to fake nighttime. And I think I faked it pretty good. Here's the raw shot I took, edited in Photoshop. The next day was quite possibly the most epic shoot day of my entire life. That's right, it was round 2 of our epic 360 shooting marathon. The previous time I went out shooting with my Icelandic friend, we shot for around 12 to 14 hours. And I knew going into this day that this one was going to be even bigger. The first stop was at a waterfall just outside of town, and I got a bunch of shots here in HDR mode. They turned out pretty good. If I could go back, I probably wouldn't have shot them in HDR. In fact, I would barely have used it at all in Iceland because it's mostly exteriors. You just don't need it for that. This one was definitely a cool shot. However, it's nothing compared to what's to come. We then stopped at an even bigger waterfall, and this thing was epic and overpowering. The sound was just so intense and amazing. It made you feel at one with nature, as corny as that sounds. So the challenge here was to get as close as possible to the waterfall without drowning or getting too much water in my 360 cameras. The first thing I tried was putting my monopod in the stream of water here. I knew because it was weighted it wouldn't fall over, and I just think this is a really cool way to cover your tracks and have something interesting at the bottom of your 360. The shot turned out pretty good, but I felt like I could still get closer. And this was a tough one because it goes against the advice from another video I made, which is keep your camera away from the water, yet my camera was getting covered in these little droplets of water the closer I got. This waterfall was truly magical, but there was also so much spray that it was absolutely drenching everyone that came near it. So what I had to do was protect my camera under my shirt, then creep closer and wait for the spray to settle down. I think it stopped for like 10 seconds every few minutes, so that was my chance to strike. And yeah, I got a lot of shots with water on the lens, but I also got one or two where it looks really good and everything's clear. Unfortunately, no matter where I positioned myself, there was a tourist taking a selfie that inevitably ended up in my 360 shot, but hey, sometimes I was in there, so suck it. I'm pretty happy with the shots I got here, and shooting manually with a fast shutter speed firstly helped me capture the water better, but also the birds flying above. I was able to capture them in midair, and there were heaps of birds, and I didn't even really realize until later how many birds there were. And to me, that makes the 360 more interesting. You want as much interesting detail as possible in your 360 shots, and that includes left, right, forwards, backwards, down and up. Our next stop was at the top of the cliffs overlooking Iceland's famous Black Beach. Here I tried a number of different positions overlooking the beach as well as different camera settings, and for some reason I just keep coming back to inbuilt HDR. It's not a good idea, I know that now, but I still hadn't fully figured that out at the time, and I wanted something a bit brighter and better exposed that I could post quickly to Instagram stories, so HDR gave me that option. So after I came to my senses, I shot in RAW and got this shot. That was taken with my selfie stick fully extended and held over the edge of the cliff with a self timer of 5 seconds to give me time to put my phone down and strike a pose. I'm happy with the final image. It probably took me 20 attempts, as do most locations, but that's why you do it. So finally you get the perfect shot with the perfect exposure, the perfect camera placement, the perfect everything. You just got to do it if you want to get your photo as close to a 10 out of 10 as possible. Next we visited the famous black sand beach, and this place was like I stepped into a dream. A beach filled with black sand, like that even exists? It's so funny how simple things, when you just change the color or something you associate one color to your entire life, suddenly this has this magical quality to it. I mean, who drives 2 hours from a major city to go to a beach and not swim? Well, people in Iceland do. And even though we have the best beaches in the world in Australia, this beach just had something so satisfying about it. And of course, I knew it was going to look satisfying on camera. I started by taking a bunch of selfies with my Z1 on a selfie stick, just holding it out near the water. I knew the contrast of the black sand with the white sea foam from the water would look incredible from my camera's perspective, so the aim was to capture the contrast as best as possible, which meant I had to take quite a few shots because water is unpredictable and you just don't know when the waves are going to crash and when the best looking sea foam is going to be near the camera. So after running around and looking like a complete idiot, I set up the camera on a monopod and I put it as close to the water as I safely could, and I waited for a wave to come and just moved past the bottom of the monopod. I wanted to capture this moment in as many ways as possible, which is why my next weapon of choice was the Insta360 Evo, and I snapped off a few 3D shots of me and Oliver as well as me on my own. Sorry, I can only show them to you here as flat photos, but I'll put a link down there to view them in 3D if you want to take a look at them on video in a headset. So after having more fun than a kid on Christmas Day, I found this awesome cave that I wanted to take some test shots in with the Z1. So I set it up at eye level and got this shot with extremely impressive dynamic range after editing in Adobe Camera Raw inside of Photoshop. Next, we went to Vic Beach, which is really close to the other beach. However, it's much bigger and there was barely anyone around when we were there, which meant Vic was our 360 playground. I got some more Z1 shots of my monopod. Some of them turned out great, some of them didn't turn out great at all. And after getting basically every possible variation of 360 photo with the black sand in the water, I knew it was drone time. Of course, Oliver had already beaten me to it and took all of those amazing B-roll shots you just saw, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let his magic drone hands discourage me from getting some kind of shot for my drone. So I got 2 panorama shots of the beach with my Mavic Air from 2 slightly different angles. I have this thing with flying drones that I like trying to capture low perspectives. Maybe it's because I don't want my drone to crash, but there's still some really unique perspectives you can get from being 4 or 5 meters up as opposed to 1 or 200. So I had the idea that I would lay down on the beach and take a panorama just meters above me, and the end result was actually not too bad. I flew it as low as I could, which ended up being maybe a meter above my body. Yeah, look, it's the same perspective as if I had to use a selfie stick just above me and held it in my hand, but I wanted to try anyway. Don't know if I'll do much with that shot, but it was fun to try. Meanwhile, the master of drones got this. Around this point, I realized this was a moment I was going to remember forever. To be in such an amazing and picturesque place so far from home, doing what I love most, being creative and having fun. I couldn't believe that one of my big bucket list items was in the process of being checked off. Time flew that day, and by the time we were ready to leave, it was 10 PM already. And I thought, you know what, one last starfish for the road isn't gonna hurt anyone. We were 2 hours from the city, and by the time it reached midnight, we were 4 hours away, and we were somewhere in the heart of Iceland. After passing one beautiful landscape after another, we finally decided to stop and capture these beautiful rivers flowing through what once were lava fields. All day I'd been thinking about this shot I wanted to get, and it was going to be called Sunnies at Midnight, and it was midnight and we were at the perfect location to take it. We thought it would be cool to stand in the middle of a riverbed because it was still shallow enough. We put our sunnies on because the sun was still out at this point. Turned the camera on, put it into HDR mode, snapped my photo and had it uploaded to Facebook and Instagram within 60 seconds. Yeah, I don't know, somehow there was still phone reception in the middle of nowhere in Iceland. At this point, the sun set as much as it can, which means it basically just dipped below the horizon, but it was still bright out enough to see. And the 4 hours of golden hour had begun. We got some seriously epic drone shots at this location. These were by far the best drone shots I'd ever taken. I was so proud of myself. I'm like, how did that even happen? Like, was that me? This river we were next to was just incredible because it started as one, then it split into 2, then 3, then 4, then each individual river would split off. So it looked almost like veins traveling through the landscape. It was so amazing to think that we were the only people here. We hadn't seen anyone else for hours. It was just us and Mother Nature. We then did what any dedicated photographer would do. We kept driving into the Icelandic wilderness, moving further and further away from civilization with every hilltop and every valley. Our final stop was around 1:30 AM and it was at the top of a volcano that was 60 kilometers all the way around. This place had to be as close to the middle of nowhere as you could possibly get. Alright, so it's close to 2 AM right now. We've been shooting for about 13 hours. And this is a massive crater. By this point, the sun was already beginning to rise. I was taking some Instagram stories and Ollie was doing his thing, taking one stunning shot after the next. At this point, I chose not to fly my drone because this place was massive and it was getting kinda windy, not to mention a little bit too low light for my limited drone shooting experience. So instead, I took some 360s with my Z1, which turned out not good. I never usually stay up past midnight, so my mind was kind of going by that point, and I was starting to forget some basic photography principles, like you can't do a jumping shot in low light in HDR mode, and my eye for composition was kind of starting to fade. I think it was around 0 degrees at that point and extremely windy, so that's when I finally became just a spectator. When he was finished, we decided to call it a night and begin our 4-hour journey back to Reykjavik. I fought to stay awake in the car ride home, and I think that's a fight I probably lost. By the time we got back to my hotel around 6 AM, I was in bed within seconds. Oh, I was so tired. So I had an epic 4-hour sleep, and then the final day in Iceland begun. I decided to spend my final day at the Blue Lagoon. I brought my suitcase, my mountain of gear, everything. This was my final stop before the airport, so I decided to make a day of it. When I got there, I went for a swim in the lagoon and just let myself be a tourist and relax without taking photos. For a bit. Then I got out my waterproof camera, the GoPro Fusion, and took a few shots that turned out okay. After my swim, I went for a walk around the surroundings of the Blue Lagoon to get some final shots with the Z1. And I've got to say, they turned out super nice. This location was so good for 360. So as much as I wanted to just go to the airport and sleep, I knew there was one more opportunity waiting to be taken. For this first shot, I used a self timer and a fast shutter speed to make sure I would be captured sharply in the air. I also deliberately lined up my shadow with the camera to avoid exposure issues. Same thing here with this shot, except this time I'm standing. With this one, I held the camera on a selfie stick above my head and captured water on both sides. And in the end, it looked great in both 360 mode and edited as a tiny planet. What more could you ask for? The evening had come pretty quickly and I had to return to the airport so I could begin my next adventure. So yeah, that was my crazy, amazing adventure in Iceland. I got my best content ever there and I'm so glad I did it. A lot of times you just think about stuff and don't do. This time, I did. If you want to see any of my content from Iceland, you can find it on my Instagram page, the interactive 360s on my Facebook page, and the 3D shots on my Via page. I'll link them all down there. And by the way, a massive, enormous thanks to my friend Oliver, the Icelandic 360 photographer, for showing me so many amazing hidden landscapes, and I would strongly suggest you check out his work because it's next level. He makes me look like an amateur, and every time I see his shots, I'm super inspired to go out and shoot and create amazing shots of my own. He's also responsible for all of the amazing drone shots in this video. I hope this video inspired you to do something on your bucket list. Go to a place on your bucket list, because if not now, when? Life is short, there's no better time than now. Bye.